This video is all about making drawers, specifically a full set of those finger joint drawers for our kitchen makeover. Because our kitchen turned 40 this year, believe it or not, and now we finally decided to renovate it, and that's what I've been occupied with every now and again for the last couple of weeks. So as you can tell, we are now in the new old kitchen, and I painted all the cabinet doors and drawer fronts and all the other visible parts of the cabinets white, which was a lot of work. And we now also installed a new kitchen worktop, and now everything looks obviously a lot brighter and a lot more modern than before. But there are still two things that I need to address, and the first is getting new hinges for the cabinet doors, because the old hinges are just completely worn out and the cabinet doors are just hanging down and cannot be adjusted anymore. And the other thing is obviously the drawers, because in 1980, when they built this kitchen, they installed those plastic drawers. And by now they are obviously also completely worn out, and they rattle around, and they are also really hard to clean because the bottom is like textured. So I really need to get rid of those. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna make a full set of new drawers for this kitchen out of Baltic birch plywood with finger joint corners and undermount full extension drawer slides. Okay, I'm back in the workshop, but before we fire up any machines, let's take a look at the construction of this drawer. This drawer consists of a bottom, two sides, a front and a back piece, and of course a false front that came from the kitchen. The front and the back piece stand about 2 millimeters proud of the sides, 2 millimeters because that is the radius of the bit that I used to round over those edges. Normally this would be done the other way around, with the sides standing proud of the front and the back piece, because normally the sides continue all the way through. But in this case, because of these box joints, I didn't have to do it that way, and I decided to let the back stick up over the sides to keep spatulas and whisks and stuff like that from getting wedged in behind the drawer. Just a little detail. The bottom sits in a groove in both side pieces and is screwed to the front and the back piece, and this allowed me to make the front and the back as identical pieces. And this way, instead of ending up with 3 different parts, I just ended up with 2 different kinds of parts, being 2 identical sides and 2 identical front and back pieces. And that of course mitigates the potential for error a lot during production. Because of the hidden drawer slides, the sides have to stick out quite a lot past the bottom, which takes away a little bit of space from inside the drawer. But of course, these hidden drawer slides just look a lot nicer than regular side-mounted drawer slides. The false front is screwed in with 1 screw through the front piece and 2 screws using the front screw holes of those Blum clips. Okay, let's build those drawers. I start by cutting the first piece of 15mm Baltic birch plywood into strips for the sides of the drawers. Because of the virus, my wood dealer couldn't really tell when the material was gonna be delivered, but I still would have had to be home when the truck shows up, so that was not an option. So I decided to get the plywood from the nearby hardware store. A bit more expensive, but instantly available, and of course from the same wood dealer. The side pieces are all the same length, so I switched to automatic mode and cut those. Next, cutting the strips for the front and back pieces. Cutting those to length is a little bit more difficult because there are 4 different widths of drawers. So I just taped the measurements and quantities to my arm to keep track of that. For cutting the box joints, I use a dado cutter from a spindle molder. A table saw is basically just a tipped over spindle molder, so that is absolutely no problem, and of course a lot cheaper than a dado stack. Of course I could use a flat tooth saw blade, but this dado cutter is just a lot wider and because of that also a lot quicker at removing material. And for cutting those box joints, I'm gonna use my computer-controlled box joint jig. But of course there are loads of other options out there for cutting box joints. This one is just very convenient and a lot of fun. But of course whenever I use this, people are always complaining like, oh, this isn't even DIY anymore. But I completely disagree with that because I came up with the design, I built it and I programmed it, and I think it doesn't get a lot more DIY than that. But of course, if you want to build something and you don't have the perfect tool to do it, then just use something else. To avoid tear out, I use a backer board. And I glued a little fence onto it to make it easier to position my pieces consistently. One of the nice things about this jig is that the width of the fingers is completely adjustable. This way I don't have to design my workpiece around a fixed size of fingers, but instead just set the width of the fingers to whatever matches my workpiece. These fingers, for example, are 9.7 millimeters wide. Because that cutter is a little bit narrower than the fingers, the box joint jig makes a little additional step sideways and a second cut for each space before advancing to the next space. With a much narrower cutter like a saw blade, it would look like this. The sides of the fingers are cut first to keep the blade from getting deflected by a partial cut, and then the material in the middle is hocked away. Before assembling the drawers, I varnished the inside because that is easier now and will allow me to wipe away any glue squeeze out during the glue up later. Now before I can glue these pieces together, I still have two milling operations to do. And the first one is to round over those corners with a 2mm roundover bit at the router table. And then I'm going to cut the groove for the bottom at the table saw. For milling the grooves for the bottoms, I use a flat-toothed saw blade at the table saw and run the pieces along the crosscut fence. The flat teeth of that blade leave a clean bottom in those dados. And with an offcut I can now dial in the perfect width of that dado and cut it to final size with a second pass. And now it's finally time to glue those box joints together. This always looks surprisingly sloth-like on video, but is actually quite stressful because you have to be really quick and focused. Every single mating surface has to be covered with glue. And if you're not quick enough, you might not manage to push those joints tight before the glue sets, and your workpiece might be trash. And for gluing those up, I of course used my homemade parallel clamps. And by measuring the diagonals, I make sure that the piece is square. These box joints will be extremely stiff when fully dry, so the pieces need to be as square as possible to begin with, because it will be very hard or impossible to adjust them later. And I first apply a lot of pressure, which pushes the joints tight on the inside, but also bends in the pieces. And then I take off most of that pressure, and when the sides straighten back out again, the outsides of the joints also close up. And that strategy seemed to work really well. I tried to use those comb-like pieces to push the joints tight, but they were just unnecessary and awkward, so I didn't use them for the rest of the drawers. I left each drawer clamped up for about 15 minutes. These box joints set up really fast. Okay, now they are all glued up and everything went well. And now I just need to flush up these protruding fingers. And there are of course a million ways to do this, but in my opinion the fastest and easiest and also the safest, which is the one that's least likely to damage the workpiece, is a random orbit sander and some 80 grit sandpaper. So the box joints turned out perfect, which is not very surprising because they were made by a computer-controlled machine. But right where the joints end, I have a little gap on some of these, and that's probably due to all the clamping and unclamping, and thus shifting the fence just a little bit on the box joint jig. A bit unfortunate, but to be honest, not a big deal. I had previously varnished this 6.5mm piece of Baltic birch for the bottoms. Now the bottom is used to check if the drawer is square. And if it's not 100% square, you can kind of square it up a little by pushing it square and then using the bottom and a clamp to hold it in place until the bottom is screwed on. And that will then keep it square. Now screwing on the Blum clips. And they need to be flush with the front, so I line them up using an offcut of plywood. Then for drilling the holes for the holding pin, I use the drawer slides themselves to mark the perfect location. You can of course buy templates for that, but they are just not necessary. And now the slides need to be installed in the cabinet. I made a simple story stick with the required measurements so that I wouldn't have to fumble around with my tape measure. First, the distance from the top, and I transfer that measurement into the cabinet using a square. The blue tape on the square is just there to protect the freshly painted edges. And now marking the 2 screw locations. I used a big 6mm drawer on the screws, so 2 per side should be perfectly sufficient. And finally attaching the false front. I first align it with the worktop and the other fronts, and then pull out the drawer by the Blum clips, and then clamp the front into place. This way no screwing in from the front or double-sided tape is needed. So I hope you liked this project. I certainly had a lot of fun, and till next time.